Welcome, bookish souls, to a sanctuary where the love for reading knows no bounds. Today, we embark on a soul-stirring journey through the pages of Fahrenheit 450, one by Ray Bradbury. If you're vibing with my content, show your support by smashing that like button and subscribing following my channel. And let's take it a step further. Leave a comment and let's create a sense of community where we can connect and engage. Part 1, T120. The narrative begins with a description of the intense, sensual, and emotional pleasure experienced by fireman Guy Montag as he aims his kerosene-fueled flamethrower at stacks of books and then at the home that housed them. After cleaning himself up at the fire hall, he walks home in the night, encountering a pretty girl, Clarisse, dressed all in white. They introduce themselves, and Clarisse recognizes him as a fireman by the salamander tattoo on his arm and the phoenix emblem on his chest. Conversation reveals that Montag and Clarisse are living in a future society in which firemen cause fires through burning books and the homes that house them rather than putting them out as they did in the past. As they part, Clarisse asks Montag whether he's happy, leaving him unsettled as he returns home, where he pauses beneath a ventilator grill and remembers that something lay hidden behind the grill, something that seemed to peer down at him now. He also remembers another strange meeting he had with an old man in the park with whom he had talked. He shakes off the feeling and enters his darkened bedroom to see his wife Mildred staring into the ceiling as she listens to the words and music coming from the ear thimbles plugged into her ears. Montag suddenly realizes that he's quite unhappy, and as he goes to his bed, kicks something on the floor, which is a bottle of sleeping pills that had been full that morning. He realizes that Mildred has taken an overdose. As he calls the hospital, there is a roar of fighter jets overhead. In response to Montag's call, a pair of medical technicians arrives and performs a pair of procedures, pumping Mildred's stomach and cleansing her blood. Their commentary revealing that they're doing increasing numbers of similar visits. After they go, Montag marvels at how people have become strangers to each other and impulsively goes out to Clarisse's house, where her family is still awake and talking, her uncle discussing how everyone in society has become disposable. The following morning, Montag wakes to find Mildred in the kitchen, still plugged into her ear timples and unaware of what happened the night before. He lets her believe that she had too good a time at a party and then prepares to go to work. As he's about to leave, he discovers Mildred excitedly looking forward to engaging in that evening's parlor entertainment. As Montag walks to the fire hall, he encounters Clarisse, happily lifting her face to the rain and opening her mouth so she can taste it. Conversation reveals that she finds Montag an unusual kind of fireman in that he actually seems to listen to and hear what she's saying. After she goes, Montag lifts his face to the rain and opens his mouth. T36. As Montag arrives at the fire hall, narration describes its mechanical hound, an 8-legged, dog-like creature used by the firemen during downtimes as amusement, betting on how long it will take to catch and kill a target animal, like a chicken or a mouse. Narration describes how Montag used to participate in these games, but a short while ago stopped, and how, when he goes down to look at the hound, it responds to him in a threatening way that it's not supposed to. When he reports its activity to Captain Beatty says, the only way something like that could happen is if some program Montag's genetic material into the hound, defining Montag as something to be watched for. Narration describes how Montag encounters Clarisse every day, and how they become closer with each encounter. One time, she plays a game with him that results in her jokingly declaring that he's not in love with anyone, a joke that he takes very seriously, wondering how he feels about Mildred. Another time, she talks about how people her age kill each other for recreation, and how most people don't really talk to each other about anything meaningful or experience anything meaningful. Meanwhile, Montag hears about a firefighter in another city who deliberately set a mechanical hound to kill him. Then, at the end of the week, he is disturbed when Clarice is nowhere to be found. Montag and his fellow firemen play cards to fill the time, the radio in the background referring to the impending war. As the game continues, Montag's mind wanders, again recalling his encounter with the old man in the park and wondering aloud about a question posed by Clarice. Specifically, whether it's true that in the past firemen fought fires instead of caused them. Beatty and the others remind him of what it says in their rule book, that firemen came into being in the late 1700s, and first of them was Benjamin Franklin. At that moment, the alarm goes off, and they rush out of the fire hall, Montag having a brief scare from the growling mechanical hound. When they reach the house to which they have been called, they discover an old woman who speaks what Montag believes are strange words. Firemen have been alerted to the presence of the books by a neighbor, and they rush into the attic to find the books by a neighbor, and they rush into the attic to find the books and douse them with kerosene. In the confusion, Montag conceals a book within his uniform. As the firemen leave, they attempt to persuade the old woman to come with them, but she refuses, indicating that she wants to stay and showing them a match in her hand. The firemen rush out, watching from the street as the woman comes out on her porch. Her quietness, a condemnation, strikes the match and sets herself, her home, and her books ablaze. On their way back to the fire hall, Montag wonders what was meant by the words said by the old woman. Beatty says they were spoken by a man being burnt alive for heresy in 1555, adding that his mind is full of bits and pieces. P. 3662. Montag arrives home, stashing the concealed book under his pillow. As Mildred talks, he finds his attention drifting and realizes he has been weeping. He listens to her take more pills, realizing how her attention and feelings have been absorbed into the entertainment system in their parlor, and starts a conversation about Clarice, saying he's been meaning to talk with Mildred about her for a while. Mildred tells him that she believes Clarice was killed after being hit by a car a few days ago, and that the rest of the family has moved away. As Montag drifts off to sleep, he imagines the mechanical hound out looking for him. The next morning, Montag tells Mildred to call Beatty and tell him he, Montag, is not coming in because he's sick, but Mildred refuses. Montag says that the burning the night before troubled him, but Mildred tells him to leave her alone. He asks when she was last really bothered by anything, but then remembers her suicide attempt. Beatty arrives, aware that Montag, now 2 hours late, is not coming in. He speaks at length about the history of book burning, describing how, over the course of centuries, writing became simultaneously less detailed and more potentially troublemaking. As a result, he says, and in the name of societal simplicity and happiness, all books were to be burned. As Beatty talks, and in spite of Montag's best efforts, Mildred plumps up his pillow and discovers the book concealed beneath it. Montag shouts at her and she leaves, going into the parlor. Meanwhile, Beatty continues, explaining further about the necessity for keeping books out of public hands. Beatty also says Clarissa and her family had been watched for some time and that she's better off dead. He concludes by saying that if, by some chance, a fireman accidentally got hold of a book or was interested in looking at one, he was allowed to keep it for 24 hours, but then it had to be burned. Montag forces Mildred to turn her attention from the parlor and listen to him. explaining that he is thinking that he may not go back to work ever, that what Beatty says about people feeling happy and peaceful is right, but that he, Montag, hasn't felt happy and peaceful in a long time. Mildred tells him to go for a drive, saying that it's satisfying to go quickly and to accidentally kill animals. Montag shuts the parlor off and says it's time for him to confess something, that she has a right to know what he's been doing. At that, he goes to the ventilator grill, pulls it off, reaches into the shaft and pulls out about 20 books. Mildred grabs one and runs with it to the kitchen, where she intends to incinerate it. Montag runs after her, pulls her to the ground, grabs the book, and tells her that maybe they can help each other through this difficult period, saying that because of his encounters with the old woman and with Clarisse, he realizes that he doesn't like himself or what he does. An arrival at the front door spooks them both, but they wait it out, and the arrival goes away. Montag then starts to read one of the books aloud. Mildred protests that it means nothing. Montag tells her that they'll keep trying. Part 2, T6382. Mildred's attention keeps turning to the silent, empty parlor as Montag struggles to make sense of the things he's reading. He's interrupted by the sound of a faint scratching at the front door, an electronic sniffing that makes Montag nervous. As bombers again fly overhead, Montag angrily wonders how the country got to be in such a permanent state of war, adding that maybe a few hours with books might help them understand. The telephone rings and Mildred answers it. As she laughs and talks with friends, Montag wonders where he could get help understanding the books and recalls again his meeting with the old man in the park, now identified as Professor Faber, and who gave Montag a means to contact him. Montag contacts Faber, asking the increasingly nervous professor how many copies of the Bible are left. Faber shouts that he suspects a trap and hangs up. Meanwhile, Mildred, who had been talking on another phone, reveals that her friends are coming over. Montag reveals that the book he saved from the old woman's house was a Bible. Mildred loses her temper, saying he's got to turn it in, saying that if they're caught, their house, and particularly her precious parlor, will be destroyed. Montag realizes that she's right, but that he's got to make a copy of it first. When Mildred asks whether he'll be home that night to watch the white clown with her in the parlor, he asks whether the white clown loves her the way he does. When she doesn't answer, he goes out, taking the Bible with him. As he rides the subway, Montag is overwhelmed by the noise of the advertisements that blare over the loudspeakers, their words initially fighting with, but then merging with, the words he's reading in the Bible. He also recalls a frustrating experience from his youth that he likens to his efforts at trying to memorize what he's reading. He eventually arrives at his destination, the home of Professor Faber, who is at first reluctant to let him in, but when he sees the Bible, opens his door. Montag admits that he's desperate for help in finding something to keep him from feeling dead and asks for Faber's help in finding it from books. Faber calls him a romantic, but then speaks at length of all the things that can be found in books that might help. Number 1, he says, is it quality of information. Number 2, leisure to digest it. And number 3, the right to carry out actions based on what we learn from the interaction. Of the first 2, Montag then confesses his plan to get his hands on more books and start educating people. Faber tells him the only way his plan will succeed is if they destroy the institution and practices of the firemen. As bombers roar overhead, Faber then says such a plan would never work and urges Montag to go home. This leads Montag to start ripping the pages out of the Bible, which in turn leads the frightened Faber to say he'll go along with the plan. He tells Montag to bring some money so they can pay a secretive printer to print another copy of the Bible and other works. Montag then says He wishes Faber could help him face down Beatty, leading Faber to show Montag a device he has invented, a version of the ear thimble that sends as well as receives. They can, Faber says, communicate using that. Faber, can listen to what Beatty is saying and tell Montag what to say in response so that together they might be able to learn whether Beatty is, in fact, one of them. Montag leaves, the modified ear thimble in his ear. P82 100. As he walks home after collecting money for the printer from an all-night robot teller, Montag listens to military broadcasts in his ear and to Faber's cynical comments on those broadcasts. Montag says he doesn't want to go from being told what to do by one side of the battle to being told what to do by someone on the other side. He wants to think independently. Faber tells him he's already becoming wise, but that Montag has to trust him for a while. He then starts reading to Faber from the Bible's book of Job. After Montag gets home, he's in the middle of a late dinner when friends of Mildred's, Mrs. Phelps and Mrs. Bowles, arrive to watch the parlor with her. As they laugh and scream at the antics on the parlor walls, which include a pair of clowns dismembering each other, Montag becomes increasingly angry until he shuts down the parlor and confronts them with conversation. That conversation reveals that both Mrs. Bowles and Mrs. Phelps have husbands fighting in the war, and that Mrs. Phelps views children as a waste of time while Mrs. Bowles views them as merely necessary to sustain the race. Conversation also implies that politics is more a matter of image than substance, and that elections are entirely manipulated. Montag loses his temper and, in spite of warnings whispered in his ear by Faber, grabs a book and starts reading poetry. Mildred covers up by explaining that once a year, every fireman's allowed to bring one book home from the old days to show his family how silly it all was, how nervous that sort of thing can make you, how crazy. Montag then reads a poem called Dover Beach, quoted in the text and which speaks of the retreat of faith from humanity. After he's finished, Mrs. Phelps is in tears. As Mildred and Mrs. Bowles calm her, the latter speaks of how dangerous, foolish, and painful reading is. As she's preparing to leave, Montag makes a great show of putting the book into the parlor's incinerator, and after Mrs. Bowles goes, hunts out the rest of the books he had concealed, noting that Mildred had already gotten rid of some of them and then hides the rest in some bushes. He then leaves for work, trying not to see how completely dark and deserted Clarice McLaren's house was. On the subway, Montag contemplates how glad he is that he and Faber are connected. Through the ear thimble, Faber speaks reassuringly, warning him to be careful but saying they're on their way to success. Montag pleads with him to stay with him. As he arrives at the fire hall, Montag discovers that the mechanical hound is gone and that Beatty is waiting for him. As the two men join the other firemen in playing cards, Montag becomes increasingly uncomfortable. As Faber again whispers caution into Montag's ear, Beatty describes a dream he had in which he and Montag got into an argument in which they quoted books at each other. A dream that ended, Beatty says, with a blazing bonfire of books and a return to peace. After Beatty has finished, Faber says quietly to Montag that now Montag has heard both sides of the conflict. It will be up to him to ultimately decide which side he wants to be on. It's up to you now, he says, to know with which ear you'll listen. Montag is about to answer when the alarm goes off and the firemen spring into action. Beatty learns the address to which they're being sent and insists that the uneasy Montag come along. As the firemen race out, Montag contemplates the foolishness and futility of doing what he did with the poem, even as Beatty is crying out here, "We go to keep the world happy, Montag." The firemen soon arrive at the site of the next book burning, Montag's house. Key 101, 123. Montag stands immobile, frozen in disbelief and confusion as Beatty taunts him about the foolishness of having read the poetry to the women and the stupidity of listening to Clarisse. Mildred rushes by, gets into the family car and drives away, mumbling to herself as Beatty tells Montag she was who called in the alarm after her friends had called in an earlier alarm which Beatty had chosen to ignore. As Faber, through the ear thimble, asks what's going on, Beatty tells Montag that he has to be the one to burn his own house, and that once he's done, he's under arrest. Faber urges him to run away, but Montag shouts that he can't. The mechanical hound would come after him. Beatty hears his comment and says yes, the hound is indeed out there. Montag realizes he has no choice, lights his flamethrower, and torches his home, taking particular pleasure in burning the now empty and impotent parlor. He also burns the books, which he realizes Mildred had brought out from their hiding place and thrown in the front lawn. Meanwhile, Beatty realizes Montag is listening to something and clouts him on the head, releasing the thimble. Beatty picks it up and announces his intention to trace whoever is speaking. This triggers Montag to turn his flamethrower onto Beatty, who screams as he goes up in flames. Montag then knocks the other two firemen unconscious and turns from them just in time to see the mechanical hound coming for him, its poisonous claw extended. The claw shoots toxins into his leg even as he incinerates the hound, his leg going numb. As people in the other houses on the street begin to stir, Montag releases he can't wait around and, hobbling on his useless leg, runs away down an alley. As he runs, and as feeling and function return to his leg, Montag realizes that for some reason Beatty wanted to die. He also realizes he still has the money he withdrew for Faber and heads to Faber's home to hand the money over and perhaps catch his breath before moving on. Through his personal ear thimble, he hears news that police forces have mobilized to track him down. As he runs from shadow to shadow, he imagines every car that goes by is pursuing him and comes close to being run down by one that actually seems to be aiming at him. But as it passes and hears the laughter coming from it, he realizes it was just young people out for fun, and that they would have killed him for fun. As he runs away, he wonders whether it was them, or people like them, who killed Clarisse. He also stops at the home of a fellow fireman, plants the books recovered from the hedge in the kitchen, and calls in an alarm, part of the plan he discussed earlier with Faber to discredit the firemen. Montag finally arrives at Faber's, where he explains what happened to the modified ear thimble, marvels at how quickly and thoroughly his life has changed, and agrees when Faber says he has finally been doing what he's been thinking about doing for a long time. For his part, Faber comments that he has never felt more alive and tells Montag to follow a disused railway where, he has heard, there are camps of university-educated refugees from society. The two men check Faber's mini-parlor for information and discover two things: that the war has restarted and that a new mechanical hound has been set in pursuit of Montag. They realize that the hound could very well track Montag to Faber's and destroy both the old man and the house. Meanwhile, Montag imagines the tracking and his inevitable execution broadcast in parlors all over the country. Together, the men plan to remove as much of Montag's scent as possible from the house, and Montag grabs some of Faber's oldest and smelliest clothes in order to disguise his smell. And then he again runs into the night. Part 3, T 123, 139. Shortly after leaving Faber's home, Montag looks through a large window into an unsuspecting household's parlor, where he sees the hound pursuing him through streets and alleys, finally arriving at Faber's house. As he silently urges the hound to move on, it pauses, tests its poisonous claw, and then leaves. Montag moves on, listening to his ear thimble as he hears the authorities broadcast an order for everyone in the area to look out their windows at exactly the same moment in hopes of catching a glimpse of the fugitive. Even as he realizes what a brilliant idea this is, Montag plunges into the river, where he removes his clothes, puts on the clothes he took from Faber, and allows himself to be swept away by the current. Moments later, the hound reaches the river, tracked by helicopters. Montag watches as the hound and helicopters realize they've lost his trail and turn away. Montag continues to drift along with the river, further and further into the countryside, enjoying the silence and the appearance of the stars, letting the suitcase he had taken from Faber sink to the bottom of the river, and contemplates the relationship between the burning of the sun and the burning he had done. Eventually, he allows himself to be drifted toward shore. As he climbs out of the river, the sight of open expanses of land and the smells of nearby farms trigger a memory of being on a farm as a child, and he half hallucinates half. Remembers resting in a loft, seeing a beautiful woman who, in his imagination, looks like Clarissa in the moonlight, and the moonlight, and a noonlight, finding fresh food left for him. His reverie is suddenly interrupted by the appearance of what he at first believes to be the hound, but is in fact a deer. He climbs up the riverbank, discovers the railway track that Faber had told him about, and, as he imagines it becoming a path to safety, suddenly realizes with strange certainty that once, long ago, Clarice had walked here where he was walking now. After walking for a while, Montag glimpses a fire in the distance, draws closer, and then stops, amazed that fire can be something other than the violence he has always known, something warm and welcoming. After a while, the men gathered around the fire invite him to join them, revealing that they're aware of who he is and what he's done. The man who seems to be their leader, Granger, introduces the men as learned refugees from the tyranny of society and shows Montag on a portable news screen how that society is falsifying his capture and death at the hands of the hound. As Montag mourns the innocent man's death, Granger tells him what bands the men of his group with thousands more like them. Each has memorized a piece of writing or a segment of a piece, while one of them has invented a process by which anyone can remember anything he ever read. Montag reveals that he himself remembers parts of the biblical book of Ecclesiastes, leading Granger to speak of the faith held by him and other members of the group that eventually the governing society will fail and there will once again be room for books and words and thoughts and ideas. The memorized texts may have to be passed on to a generation of young people, but they will continue. P. 139, 149. As the men break camp, Montag watches their faces and realizes that the hope they have in their heads isn't visible in their faces. Don't judge a book by its cover, one of them jokes. Meanwhile, fighter jets scream overhead as the men move on, and Granger speaks at length of his grandfather, a man who advocated living fully and inquisitively, and who believed in human beings leaving something good behind when they die. At that moment, the war begins in earnest as jets fly overhead and the city is bombed. In his mind, Montag cries out to Mildred, to Faber, and to Clarice to get out of the city, but then realizes that Faber is safe and Clarice is already dead. This leaves Mildred, who Montag imagines being incinerated in her hotel room, realizing in her last moments of life that life is as empty of meaning and truth as the images on her parlor walls. He also imagines the city rebuilt and reborn, transformed and beautiful and alive. But in actuality, Montag and the others lie on the ground with the heat and dust of the bombing of the city blowing over them, the silence of death and destruction building around them. Montag frantically struggles to remember the parts of Ecclesiastes he had memorized, crying out to himself that a new world is beginning with him in that moment. As the men slowly get to their feet, they look to where the city once stood and realize it has been blown to ashes. Montag wonders how many other cities had been destroyed in that way. The sun then begins to come up, and the men start a fire to cook some breakfast. As it's cooking, Granger speaks of the mythological phoenix and how humanity, in its capacity to destroy itself and then become reborn, goes through the same sort of process. He adds that unlike the phoenix, however, humanity has the memory of its past to take into account as it plans for its future. The men eat their breakfast. The sun rises into the sky, and the birds scattered by the explosion return to the trees. Montag finds himself in the lead of the procession of walking, remembering men, and finds himself remembering the words of Ecclesiastes he had memorized. He imagines that the other men will, after a while, begin murmuring their memorized words to themselves to make sure they're still there, and resolves to not murmur his own words, the Ecclesiastes words, until later that day, when they reach the city.